Building on what you were just talking about, I'm wondering, I have some very intelligent, very thoughtful, libertarian-leaning friends, and they criticize.
We all had that.
Yes, yes, and they criticize the government as being, bloated and too far removed from the people. I'm wondering if the argument that you're making, even though it's really socialism, if that wouldn't appeal to them as well, because wouldn't it reduce the size of the federal government? And if so, how then would we also regulate the enterprises within the economy on as a whole?
Good. Let me try to respond. There's an irony in the position that I have as a socialist and a libertarian. We agree that the government is ineffective, that the government is bloated, that the government serves too few people too well and too many people too poorly. So we agree on that. What we apparently don't agree on is how to explain that and therefore what to do about it. In my view, the single most important reason that the government functions as badly as it does is because it is controlled and dependent on the same economic and social forces that run our business enterprises. Whether you look at what the jobs were of the leading government officials, which almost invariably were as top corporate executives, or you look at who has the army of lobbyists in Washington that literally write the laws that get passed, and that turns out to be the biggest corporations in America, et cetera, et cetera. For me, the problem of an ineffective government is its utter dependence, in a way that I frankly abhor, its utter dependence on big money, on wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals. You can see who contributes the biggest money to the political parties. You can see who contributes the bulk of the money to the political candidates. It is obvious to anyone who isn't ideologically blinded that we have a government which, as one critic once said, we have the best government money can buy, and that's exactly the problem. It's that money buys it. So for me, the explanation for the government's failure to perform much better than it does for the average person is that it's dependent not on the average person, but on the horribly small minority that has the economic wealth. So for me, therefore, the solution is not to pass a dozen laws about how it shouldn't be like that, because the people with the money, the corporations and the wealthy, are very skilled and have a long experience in how to evade such laws, how to over time weaken such laws, and then when they're strong enough to obliterate and cancel those laws. Just to give you one example. Out of the Great Depression came the perception that should strike everyone these days as quite familiar, that one of the major causes of the Great Depression was the irresponsible behavior of large American banks. So a bill was passed. It was called the Glass-Steagall Act, the Banking Reform Act in the early 1930s, that created a wall between the kind of bank that takes people's and businesses' deposits and lends them out, something called the commercial bank on the one hand, and an investment bank, a bank that takes money that investors give it and then can take risks with that money. And a wall was separated because the idea was we shouldn't allow banks to take undue risk with other people's money who don't want a risk taken because they're just depositing money which they want to have access to. As soon as that bill was proposed, the banks went to work to try to prevent it from being passed, sort of like the way they worked real hard over the last few years to water down, which they're still doing, the Dodd-Frank Act and all the other acts supposedly to regulate our banking sector again. When that didn't work after a while, what the banks did is they weakened the law. First they evaded it, then they weakened it. And by the 1990s, they were ready for the final charge. They went to the Congress, led by the biggest American banks, spending a fortune of money to persuade, to cajole senators and congressmen and women, and they got the bill passed to cancel the Glass-Steagall Act. And in 1999, then President Bill Clinton signed it. And wouldn't you know, in 1999, they canceled that bill. 8 years later, the banking sector of the United States took the entire economy right back in to the kind of irresponsible behavior leading to crisis that the Glass-Steagall Act was supposed to prevent. This is a wonderful example of why passing rules and regulations doesn't do the job, because it leaves in position the wealthy folks, the large corporations in and out of the banking sector who have enormous resources and every incentive to evade or weaken or eliminate the rules and regulations they don't want. And having learned how to do that over the last 30 years, the one thing we can predict with certainty is if all we do is Robert Reich type of rules and regulations, again, a replay of the 1930s, that the wealthy and the corporations will be able to undo all of that much more quickly this time, thanks to all their experience over the last 30 years. And for Mr. Reich and others like him, I would say the old saw. The first time we tried rules and regulations and the other side basically did an end run around them, shame on them. But if all we do, now that we see the fruits of what we left undone in the 1930s, if all we do is do it all again, then it should be shame on us. We haven't learned what we should learn. This time, we have to make sure that the people in control of the corporations of America will not and cannot use their wealth to undo the democratic reorganization of an economy that was done in the depths of a crisis to help the masses of people out of a level of suffering they should not and should never have been subjected to. So that's why the kind of, let's call it liberalism that Robert Reich espouses does seem to me too late, too little, and inadequate in terms of what we've learned the nature of the problem really is.
How would you respond to the defenders of capitalism who essentially say or suggest that wealth is not a static quantity and it's generated, it's born out of ideas and innovation and ingenuity, and so capitalism is uniquely well suited to generate new wealth, and essentially if you haven't acquired wealth, it's because you haven't been creative enough or worked hard enough to acquire it. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'm always amazed. You're quite right. I hear that sort of thing, too. But I'm always taken aback in a way that I can only describe as a kind of, my goodness, how have you managed not to learn certain basic realities of the world in which you live? Because if you knew them, you couldn't say things like that. Let me give you an example. There are 1,000 surveys of what the wealth comes from that is owned by wealthy people in the United States. And these studies all show one thing, that the most important source of wealth for people in America today is the wealth they inherited from their parents. The second most important source of the wealth that people have today has to do with the educational and job opportunities they found available to them because of the wealth and social status of their parents. The bottom line, therefore, is we don't generate wealth in the United States because individuals have good ideas. The wealth in our society, such as it is distributed among our people, is a family-generated and a family-protected series of inheritances. We long ago, as a nation, gave up on an early American idea, which was that everybody should start life more or less at the same point. And so you get further along then, if we all start at the same point, according to how clever you are, how hard you work, and all of those meritocratic kinds of ideas. But we don't do that. We allow people to inherit millions and millions of dollars, and the argument that they start at the same point that people who have nothing is not serious, and I'm not going to take it seriously, and I don't think most Americans would give it 2 seconds of serious attention. It simply is not the case. Number two, if you think, as I do, that the creative impulse in human beings, the source of new ideas, new ways of doing things, new concepts of how to organize all kinds of activities, from a factory to an office to a store to a sports team to a religion, whatever. If the creative spark of people is what you want to liberate, well then capitalism is really poor at that. Because what capitalism does is take a tiny number of people and give them the kind of wealth, the kind of leisure, the kind of range of opportunities that can nurture their creativity, reward their creativity. But for the mass of people, getting by is the number one objective in life. Getting a job, any job, getting a job that's secure, even if it isn't 100% secure, being able to pay off a mountain of debts. When you have those kinds of oppressive daily burdens on you, it quickly extinguishes much of your creativity. It leaves little time, little energy, little of that oomph you need to do that kind of thing. I would argue that what I'm proposing, an economic system based on worker cooperatives, where every worker has a job description of 2 parts. One part is the particular task you do in the division of labor of your office, your store, or your factory. But the other part of your job, of every worker's job, is to be part of the directorship, the design of what is to be done, the big decisions that are to be made. Those kinds of responsibilities, the responsibilities of directing and designing and conceiving, those are the kinds of responsibilities that are the ones most able, and we know this from human history, to draw forth from people their new ideas, their clever insights, their original understandings. We want a system that's more productive than the one we have, then we ought to be able to liberate all of those people who have the potential to do that, to be in a position where they have the time and the energy and the support to do that. We condemn most Americans to a life in which, against enormous odds, they would have to be creative, instead of making the odds much better by providing a much less unequal, a much less tilted playing field for everybody to work on. So for me, I understand capitalism is a more technologically dynamic system than the feudalism that preceded it. I give that to capitalism. I have no hesitance in saying I think that's true. But I also think, by the same logic, that if we can free all people to be part of the creative process of designing and adjusting and directing enterprises, not just to be drones in somebody else's enterprise, I think we will see a kind of creativity and a kind of dynamism that will make us look back on capitalism and scratch our heads the way capitalists always did about feudal lords. Why did people allow such a relatively unproductive system to exist so long now that we know how much better we can do? I think the same thing is going to happen in the future vis-a-vis capitalism.
Okay, last question, Professor Wolff, and it's a crucial one. What are the first steps that we can begin to take as a society to move in this direction towards actual legitimate democracy and away from this repressive capitalist system that we currently reside in?
Well, there's 2 things. Again, there's one at the level of ideas and theory and understanding and science, and then on another one, a very practical. So let me do them in order. The first thing is to bring these ideas systematically to the American people. That's why I wrote the book, Democracy at Work. That's why I travel all around the country giving talks. That's why I have a radio program around the country that I do every week, et cetera, et cetera. The idea is two basic ideas. One, that a cooperative way of organizing an enterprise is a way that would make you, each of you listening, a happier human being. You are not just a drone. You don't want to always take orders when you work. That your job is the biggest thing in your life in most cases. 5 out of every 7 days, you go to work. You give it the best hours of your life. And if you look at your day, it's either preparing for work, getting to work, doing the work, or coming home, or recouping yourself so you can do it again tomorrow. If we want to take that seriously, then we ought to create a cooperative workspace, because you'll be a happier and more productive person in it. Number two, second idea, if we take seriously our commitment to democracy, which I do, and I think most Americans do, then we have to face, however difficult it is, a stark reality. From the beginning of this nation's founding, we have not applied democracy to the workplace. We thought we should have a democratic community. We thought we should have a democratic politics. But we seem never to have understood that you can't really get a democratic society and a democratic politics if the economic foundation of your society is systematically undemocratic and indeed anti-democratic. If we organize our enterprises the way capitalism does, so that a tiny group of people at the top, the major shareholders, together with the board of directors, have all the power, make all the basic decisions, and everybody else who works there has to live with the results of those decisions but is excluded from participating in them, then the reality, the stark reality of the United States is it keeps trying, and I think largely failing, to have a democratic politics, but it's not for any strange or nefarious reason. We don't have a very democratic politics because we have a very undemocratic economic system. And we should not be surprised that the extraordinary wealth accumulated by major shareholders and top executives on the boards of directors is used by those folks to control our political system, because they are afraid, and for good reason, that if they didn't control the political system, we, the mass of people, would use the universal suffrage, because we have the majority of votes, because we're the majority of people, to undo by political means the unequal results of a capitalist economic system. To prevent that, they control politics, and so we have neither economic democracy nor, in the end, much more than a formal political democracy. And I think those are powerful arguments that would lead people to say that they want to see, they want to prefer, they would like at least the option of having real choice when it comes to where they work, as to whether they do it in a top-down, undemocratic capitalist organization of an enterprise versus a democratic, cooperative, worker, self-directed enterprise. As to what we can do practically, again, I think there's some easy ways to take these steps. And let me give you one by way of an analogy. In the long history of the United States, it didn't take long for small businesses in America to decide that they were having a harder and harder time competing with big businesses, because the big businesses had certain advantages which they were using to destroy, to defeat, and eventually to absorb small businesses. Big businesses could get credit more easily. They could pay lower interest rates for a loan. They had more pull with the government, et cetera, et cetera. And so small businesses got together and said, we believe that Americans as a people don't want to have only big businesses. That's politically dangerous. It's not desirable for all kinds of reasons. We want the American people to support a leveling of the playing field, a set of things that will make it easier for small businesses to begin, for small businesses to succeed and grow, and to be part of the economic landscape of the United States. And along the way, they established something called the Small Business Administration, which is an arm of the federal government that gives special privileges to small businesses, access to credit on more favorable terms than they might otherwise get, technical assistance, orders from the government for whatever they produce, and so on. Well, here's a simple extension. We ought to have a cooperative business administration, a part of the government that gives cheap credit, technical assistance, orders. In other words, creates a bit more of a level playing field that enables co-ops to form, enables co-ops to grow, so that Americans really have a choice as to where they want to work and from whom they want to shop. Last, practical. Just to give you one, and if I had time, I could give you a dozen. I'm going to pick an example of a country, in this case Italy, which had an imaginative way of helping to build its cooperative sector, which, by the way, is larger than the cooperative sector in most other European countries. Here's what the Italians did. They passed a law in 1985. It's called the Marcora Law, M-A-R-C-O-R-A, after the Italian legislator who passed this bill. And here's what they do. They give all unemployed Italian workers, male and female, two options when they lose their job. The first option is to get a weekly unemployment check, rather like we do here in the United States, and they get it for a couple of years if they're unemployed. But they have an option B, which Americans do not have. Option B works like this. If you become unemployed, the Italian government will give you your entire 2 years' worth of weekly unemployment benefit checks right up front in a lump sum right now. In order to get that, though, you have to do two things. One, you have to find at least 9 other unemployed workers who make the same choice you do, namely to get their unemployment up front as a lump sum. And you all, 10 of you, 10 or more, have to agree, here we go now, to use the lump sum given to you by the government as the capital to begin a worker cooperative enterprise. The idea of the Italian government was ingenious. The thought was, we're going to give this money to these people anyway. Why not give it to them now, have them actually start a business? Because these workers, if it's their own business, will work 5 times harder and 5 times more creatively to make that business succeed, because it's their real chance in life. It's their way to convert unemployment from a disaster into the biggest opportunity of their lives. Number 2, we will tell them, which they do, that if you fail at this business, you can't go back to unemployment because you've already gotten it. So this is your one chance. And all I can tell you is thousands of Italian unemployed workers took that option, and that's one of the reasons why Italy has many, many more successful worker co-ops than most other European countries, because that was a very practical way to help build that sector and therefore to build the popular appreciation and the popular support, including from political parties. The conservatives, the business interests have tried to get rid of the Marcora law repeatedly since 1985, and they have been unable to do so because the support for co-ops, once Italians saw them around their communities and could see and evaluate what it meant and what the life was like and how it was an experience, the support for co-ops in Italy is very solid. And so I think this provides you with the kinds of things that would make it possible.